The macabre history of the FairchildsTheir. 10 kids lived poor, unaware of a hidden fortune in the forgotten corners of rural America, where hope withers like autumn leaves and dreams are buried beneath the weight of survival. Stood a weathered, clapboard house that seemed to lean against the very winds of despair. This was the home of the Fairchild family, a name that would echo through the corridors of local folklore for generations to come, though not for reasons anyone could have imagined. The year was 1987, and Martha's Creek, population 847, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet somehow, the most devastating secret of all remained hidden in plain sight. The Fairchild house sat at the end of Willow Lane, its paint peeling like old scabs, its porch sagging under the weight of broken promises and shattered dreams. Inside this crumbling sanctuary lived 12 souls, Harold and Vera Fairchild, and their 10 children, ranging in age from 3 to 17. The Fairchild children were easily recognizable throughout Martha's Creek, not by their faces, which often bore the hollow expression of chronic hunger, but by their clothes, a patchwork collection of hand-me-downs, donated garments from the local church, and items salvaged from the town's thrift store on half-price Wednesdays. Harold Fairchild was a man whose back had been bent by more than just physical labor. At 42, he looked 60, his hands permanently stained with motor oil from his job at Peterson's Auto Repair, where he earned barely enough to keep the lights on and food, however meager, on the table. His wife Vera, once the prettiest girl in Martha's Creek High School's class of '65, now appeared as a ghost of her former self, her auburn hair prematurely gray, her green eyes dulled by the relentless grind of poverty and the overwhelming task of raising 10 children on next to nothing. The Fairchild children learned early that asking for seconds at dinner was futile, that new clothes were a luxury reserved for dreams, and that Christmas morning meant homemade gifts fashioned from whatever materials could be found around the house. Sarah, the eldest at 17, had already accepted that college was an impossible fantasy. Instead, she worked part-time at the local diner, her tips going straight into the family's survival fund. The younger children, Michael, Jennifer, David, Rebecca, Thomas, Amanda, Christopher, Emily, and little Joseph, had never known anything different. To them, this was simply life. What made the Fairchild's situation particularly tragic in the eyes of Martha's Creek was not just their poverty, but Harold's apparent resignation to it. Unlike other struggling families in town who fought tooth and nail for every opportunity, who applied for assistance programs and sought help from community organizations, Harold seemed almost to embrace their destitution with a strange, inexplicable acceptance. When neighbors offered better-paying job opportunities, he politely declined. When the local church suggested applying for federal assistance programs that could significantly improve their situation, he mumbled something about not wanting charity and changed the subject. This puzzling behavior became the subject of countless conversations at Murphy's General Store and after Sunday services at Martha's Creek Baptist Church. How could a man watch his children go to bed hungry night after night and refuse help that was readily available? How could he seem so passive in the face of his family's obvious suffering? The children themselves began to notice their father's odd behavior as they grew older. Sarah, in particular, observed how Harold would sometimes disappear for hours on end, claiming he was looking for work, only to return empty-handed and more withdrawn than before. She noticed how he would intercept the mail before anyone else could see it, sorting through letters with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to their simple family correspondence. Most strangely, she observed how her father would sometimes stare out the kitchen window toward the old Fairchild property land that had been in the family for 3 generations, but had been sold off, piece by piece over the years, to pay for what Harold claimed were unexpected expenses. The old Fairchild homestead, now just a foundation overgrown with weeds and brambles, sat 2 miles outside of town. Local legend held that Harold's grandfather, Ezekiel Fairchild, had been something of an eccentric, a man who trusted neither banks nor people, who had made his fortune in timber and railroad investments during the early 1900s. But whatever wealth the family had once possessed seemed to have vanished long before Harold's generation came of age. As winter approached in 1987, the Fairchild family's situation grew increasingly desperate. The ancient furnace in their basement had finally given up, leaving them to heat the house with space heaters that drove their electricity bill to impossible heights. Harold's hours at the auto shop had been cut due to the seasonal slowdown, and Vera's health had been declining, her persistent cough that she couldn't shake, a fatigue that seemed to seep into her very bones. It was during this darkest period that strange things began to happen around the Fairchild house. Sarah noticed her father making late-night phone calls, his voice hushed and urgent. She observed him burning papers in the backyard, fire barrel papers that looked official, important. Most disturbing of all, she caught him one night standing in the children's bedroom doorway, watching his sleeping sons and daughters with an expression she had never seen before. Not love, not concern, but something that looked almost like ... guilt. The first real crack in the facade came when Mrs. Henderson from the county social services office made an unexpected visit. She had received an anonymous tip about the living conditions at the Fairchild house, and her inspection revealed what everyone in Martha's Creek already knew: 10 children living in conditions that bordered on neglect, not from lack of love, but from apparent lack of resources. But here's where the story takes its first, truly macabre turn. When Mrs. Henderson began the process of connecting the family with available assistance programs, food stamps, heating assistance, medical care for Vera's deteriorating health, Harold's response was not gratitude, but panic. He became agitated, almost frantic, insisting that they would figure things out on their own, that they didn't need outside help, that everything would be resolved soon. Mrs. Henderson, a veteran social worker who had seen every form of pride and stubbornness imaginable, found Harold's reaction genuinely disturbing. It wasn't pride she was witnessing, it was fear. But fear of what? Fear of accepting help, fear of government interference, or fear of something else entirely. As Chapter 1 draws to a close, we see the Fairchild family entering what would be their final winter of ignorance. The children, huddled together for warmth in their unheated bedrooms, had no idea that their suffering was not the result of cruel fate or economic hardship, but of a deliberate, calculated deception that had been perpetrated against them for their entire lives. The truth, a truth so shocking that it would eventually tear apart not just the Fairchild family, but the very fabric of Martha's Creek itself lay waiting to be discovered. And that discovery would come not through investigation or accident, but through the most mundane of circumstances: a routine inspection of the town's old records, triggered by Mrs. Henderson's report and the county's decision to investigate Harold Fairchild more thoroughly. What they would find would prove that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed not by strangers in the dark, but by those entrusted with our care and protection. The Fairchild children were about to learn that they had been living a lie so profound and so devastating that it would redefine their understanding of not just their family, but of human nature itself. The revelation began with a clerical error, what appeared to be one, when Mrs. Henderson submitted her report on the Fairchild family to the county offices. A routine cross-reference check flagged an inconsistency in Harold Fairchild's financial records. According to the county's property tax database, Harold Fairchild was listed as the beneficiary of a trust fund established in 1952 by his grandfather, Ezekiel Fairchild. The trust, which had been earning compound interest for over 35 years, was valued at approximately $1.2 million. At first, county officials assumed this was simply an administrative error, a case of mistaken identity or outdated records. After all, if Harold Fairchild had access to over $1 million, Why would his family be living in poverty? Why would his wife be suffering from untreated illness? Why would his children be going to school in clothes that had been donated by local charities? But, as investigators dug deeper, the truth began to emerge like a corpse rising from a shallow grave. Harold Fairchild had indeed been receiving monthly distributions from his grandfather's trust fund since his 21st birthday, substantial payments that should have ensured his family lived comfortably, if not luxuriously. The question was not whether the money existed, but where it was going. The answer, when it finally came to light, would prove to be more horrifying than anyone in Martha's Creek could have imagined. Harold Fairchild was a gambling addict, but not just any gambling addict. Harold had been systematically stealing from his own children for over 2 decades, taking money that should have provided them with food, clothing, healthcare, and education, and feeding it into a network of underground poker games, illegal sports betting operations, and eventually, when his local debts became too overwhelming, into the hands of loan sharks who operated out of the nearest city, 3 hours away. The monthly trust distributions, which should have amounted to approximately $3,000 per month, more than enough to lift the Fairchild family into middle-class comfort, had been disappearing into Harold's gambling addiction like water into sand. But the cruelty didn't end there. When the trust money wasn't enough to cover his losses, Harold had begun taking out loans against the family's property, using the children's names and social security numbers to secure credit he had no intention of repaying. The investigation revealed a paper trail of forged documents, falsified applications, and identity theft that stretched back 15 years. Harold had been stealing his children's identities to fuel his gambling addiction, destroying their credit before they were even old enough to understand what credit meant. By the time Sarah Fairchild turned 18, she would discover that her credit score was already ruined by debts she had never incurred, for luxuries she had never enjoyed. But perhaps the most damning discovery was what investigators found in Harold's hidden safety deposit box, rented under a false name in the next county over. Inside were detailed records of his gambling activities, including IOUs, totaling over $400,000 to various illegal gambling operations. Also in the box were photographs of his children, along with notes detailing their ages, social security numbers, and future potential value as collateral. Harold Fairchild had not just been stealing from his children's present here, had been planning to steal their future. The investigators found evidence that Harold had been in negotiations with loan sharks to use his older children as collateral for his gambling debts. Sarah, at 17, had already been promised to work off a portion of her father's debt through what amounted to indentured servitude at a series of businesses owned by Harold's creditors. The final, most horrifying discovery came when investigators searched the basement of the Fairchild home. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a cache of documents that revealed the true scope of Harold's betrayal. Among these papers was a copy of Ezekiel Fairchild's original will, which showed that the trust fund was just the beginning. The old man had also left behind property holdings, stock investments, and a life insurance policy that, combined with the trust fund, would have made the Fairchild family millionaires. Harold had been systematically hiding, stealing, or gambling away an inheritance worth over $3 million, while his children slept on mattresses stuffed with old newspapers and went to school hungry. The investigation also revealed that Harold's behavior had not gone entirely unnoticed. 3 different relatives had attempted to contact the family over the years to discuss the children's inheritance, but Harold had intercepted their communications and fabricated stories about the family's circumstances to keep them at bay. He had told his own brother that the children were doing well in private schools in another state. He had convinced his late father's lawyer that the family had relocated to Canada. He had woven a web of lies so complex and so thorough that even experienced investigators had difficulty unraveling it completely. When the truth finally came out, the impact on Martha's Creek was devastating. neighbors who had donated clothes and food to the Fairchild. Children learned that their charity had been unnecessary, that the family should have been among the wealthiest in the county. Teachers who had quietly paid for school supplies out of their own pockets discovered that the children they had been helping were actually heirs to a fortune. Local church members who had been contributing to a special fund for the Fairchild family's medical expenses realized they had been unknowing accomplices in Harold's deception. But nowhere was the impact more devastating than on the Fairchild children themselves. Sarah, who had sacrificed her dreams of college to work at the local diner, learned that her grandfather had specifically set aside funds for all of his grandchildren's education funds that could have sent her to any university in the country. Michael, who had been wearing the same pair of shoes for 2 years because the family couldn't afford new ones, discovered that there was money sitting in accounts bearing his name that could have bought him anything he wanted. The younger children, some too young to fully understand the magnitude of their father's betrayal, would grow up knowing that their childhood of poverty and deprivation had been entirely unnecessary, that every hungry night, every cold winter morning, every embarrassing moment at school, when their poverty was obvious to their classmates, had been the result of their father's choice to prioritize his gambling addiction over their well-being. Harold Fairchild was arrested on charges of fraud, identity theft, child endangerment, and embezzlement. The investigation revealed that his gambling debts had grown so large that he had been planning increasingly desperate measures to satisfy his creditors. Among the papers found in his safety deposit box were preliminary agreements to sell his younger children to human trafficking operations, documents that suggested Harold's descent into moral bankruptcy was complete. Vera Fairchild, whose health had deteriorated dramatically due to years of stress and untreated medical conditions, suffered a complete psychological breakdown when the truth was revealed. The realization that her husband had been deliberately keeping their children in poverty, while millions of dollars sat in trust accounts, proved too much for her fragile mental state. She was hospitalized and would spend the remainder of her life in psychiatric care, never fully recovering from the betrayal. The Fairchild children, now wards of the state, would eventually gain access to their inheritance, but the damage had been done. Years of malnutrition had affected their physical development. The psychological trauma of learning that their suffering had been deliberate and unnecessary would require decades of therapy. Most tragically, the trust and innocence that should characterize childhood had been stolen from them in the cruelest way possible, not by strangers or by fate, but by the person who should have protected them above all others. Martha's Creek itself was forever changed by the Fairchild scandal. The tight-knit community that had prided itself on looking after its own was forced to confront the fact that they had all been deceived, that their charity and concern had been manipulated by a man who was systematically destroying his own children's lives. The case became a cautionary tale, studied by social workers and law enforcement agencies across the country. An example of how evil can hide behind a facade of poverty and desperation. Harold Fairchild died in prison 3 years into his sentence, alone and unmourned. His death certificate listed the cause as a heart attack, but those who knew the full story understood that he had been killed by the weight of his own guilt and the knowledge that he had destroyed the lives of the 10 people who had loved and trusted him most. The Fairchild house on Willow Lane still stands today, empty and abandoned. Local residents claim it's haunted not by ghosts, but by the echoes of childhood laughter that should have been filled with joy, but was instead shadowed by unnecessary suffering. The children, now adults, have scattered across the country, their inheritance allowing them to build new lives far from Martha's Creek and the memories of their stolen childhood. But money, as they all learned too late, cannot buy back time, cannot restore innocence, cannot undo the fundamental damage done when the person meant to protect you becomes the source of your greatest harm. The macabre history of the Fairchilds serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating poverty is not financial, but moral, and that the greatest fortunes in the world cannot compensate for the wealth of trust and security that, once stolen, can never truly be recovered.
Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret. And tonight, you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,